from undisclosed locations for reasons of security and insecurity, we present to you tonight MnRTV Show, the live show. And, well, it's a recorded show because of technical difficulties. But anyhow, tonight we'll be talking about the power grid. How vulnerable is it? With special guest Benjamin Dancer. I mean, we rely so much on the power grid in modern times that we don't know what we're going to do without it, you know. And computers, cell phone, tablets, smart TVs, etc. is all on it, and heating and everything else. How much can we do without it? But without further ado, here is the one and the only, the madman from Montreal, Mario. Welcome to the MnRTV Show.
Yes, I'm glad to be on. Unfortunately, Hangout was not working. You see how much we depend on Hangout for it to be working, you know? I mean, it's ridiculous. Why must we depend so much on this technology that's not even reliable, you know? I mean, it's not.
I know, and I think we've got the perfect man tonight to talk about this, Benjamin Dancer. And this show's been brought to you by the Montreal Anti-Illuminati Task Force. And let's get Benjamin on. Let's call him up.
All right, let's
call
do
him
this. All right.
Hello.
Hello, Benjamin. Welcome to the MnRTV Live Show. How are you?
Thank you. I'm fine. Thanks for having me.
That's great. Are you able to hear us good?
Yeah, I can hear fine. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So, welcome to the MnRTV Show. And can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you got involved in this?
Yeah. So I was writing a thriller, and I had in mind the story I wanted to tell. I wanted to tell a story about fathers, and I wanted to tell it in a thriller so men would be more likely to read it. And I needed a plot. I needed a bad guy who was going to do something horrible. And I started doing some research, and I came across the EMP Commission report published in 2008 for Congress. And I read that, and I was horrified by what I read. It was hard to believe. It was hard to accept it as real, because it laid out just how vulnerable and dependent we are on the power grid. And I realized I could not make up anything more scary than that. So I did my research and I adopted that. The bad guy in my story intends to take down the grid in order to commit mass murder. You and I and everybody we love would die if he's successful.
Oh, okay. And does this involve North America? Because here we're in Canada, so this incorporate North America.
Yeah, you might be worse off in Canada because of the cold winter. So our grids are interconnected. As a matter of fact, there's a joint U.S.-Canadian strategy that Obama set in motion to secure the grid, and that strategy is due to report out any day in December about how they think we ought to best go about doing this, because we are interconnected.
It would just be sort of like a Y2K situation.
It would be much worse. So if I could just kind of talk about how, in a worst case scenario, if the grid were to go down today and not come back up again, let's just assume North America, most of us would die, you and I and everybody we love. And to make sense of that, you got to go back in time about 100 years. 100 years ago, you couldn't commit mass murder by taking down the grid. That's because there were fewer people then. Food was grown outside the urban centers, and the agricultural area per capita was greater in the past than it is now. Today in America, there are 375 million people. 100 years ago, there were only 76 million. So in America, our urban centers have outstripped the carrying capacity of the surrounding landscapes. So we ship our food over very long supply lines. I'm sure it's the same in Canada.
Yes.
Those supply lines are dependent on fossil fuels, and that fuel is manufactured with electricity. So if the grid were to go down, the biggest problem we're going to face is we simply can't feed the population, not without the efficiencies brought to us with electricity.
So this would be catastrophic if something like this would happen. But isn't there safeguards for something like this not to happen, like a terrorist or some organization to do this? And is there a safeguard against, say, a solar flare?
I wish there were. There are no safeguards. The space science, in a minute we can get into the mechanisms of destruction, ways the grid could go down. But to date, there's nothing. And so a very small group of people could do this. And just to illustrate the vulnerability with one more little image, it was electricity that made it possible to increase the population of the planet from less than 2 billion people 100 years ago to 7.5 billion people today. Electricity brought us fertilizers in the 1940s, the most important population booster in this list, pesticides, mechanical irrigation. It brought us farm machinery, the fuel to run that farm machinery, mechanical irrigation, or food processing factories. All those technologies are electrically powered. So if the whole grid were to go down, we would lose the capacity. We're really efficient at feeding a lot of people because of electricity. And without it, we simply couldn't take care of all the need. So there are... Go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead, sir.
I was going to tell us that there are 4 mechanisms of destruction that could realistically take down the grid. Every conquering army in human history has understood that a civilization is as vulnerable as its food supply. Here in America, we've forgotten that. We've been prosperous for so long. We're simply not aware that the following 4 things would put us in a situation where most people would starve to death. An EMP attack, a cyber attack, mechanical sabotage, and as you mentioned, a coronal mass ejection. All 4 of those events have the potential of taking down the power grid.
So the thing is, what's out of the 4 of them, what's the most likely that could happen? Like what percentage of it?
I've noticed in America, if you're conservative in your politics, you're concerned about the various forms of attack, especially cyber. If you're more progressive or liberal, you're more concerned about space weather and the sun. NASA cited a paper on its website stating that the probability of a coronal mass ejection large enough to take down the grid hitting Earth is 12% per decade. We had an event in 1859 called the Carrington event. That was the last time a very large coronal mass ejection hit us with enough power to take down the electrical infrastructure. In 1859, that was the telegraph lines. They went down planet-wide. If we were to be hit by an event like that today, we've got nothing. The only thing we have in place is a plan to turn things off. We just launched a satellite to help monitor space weather activity because this is a very new science and we're just beginning to understand it. So the safety plan today is to see it coming and try to turn anything that was vulnerable off. And that would mitigate some of the negative impact, but it wouldn't protect us, not completely.
So there's really nothing much we can do about it.
Well, actually, there's a lot we can do about it. We're just not.
That's it. That's what I mean. Yeah, go ahead.
There's NERC and FERC who regulate the industry in the United States and perhaps in North America. They're run by the same people who run these independent power companies. So there's not a lot of incentive for them to regulate the industry to protect us from these types of threats because it's expensive. So they just simply haven't done it. And more than that, it's very complicated. The grid is owned by lots of different private entities, and it's not clear who should own this problem in America: the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, the private investors. So nobody's done anything. Now, I should state that Donald Trump, well, two things. I'll go back in time. In October, President Obama signed an executive order to direct America to figure out how to protect the grid from space weather threats. And just last week, President-elect Donald Trump stated in his YouTube address that his national security priority would be on day one to sign executive action to secure our critical infrastructure from cyber attacks and all other forms of attacks. So people are waking up to the threat, and they're starting to take it seriously. But if it were to happen right now, it would be really bad news.
But if the power grid went down, do we have to worry about the nuclear power plants going off, like, say, Fukushima or something? Or could all the missiles go off? What's the scenario with that?
The missiles are not going to go off, but the power plants would be a catastrophe. So let's lay that out. Let's just talk about how a cyber attack could do this, because that's the focus of the Trump administration.
Okay.
And the other forms of attack would have the same result. It would just happen differently. So cyber attack on our critical infrastructure, a well-planned one to destroy us, would intentionally cripple the hardware. You can manipulate the control systems of anything connected to the internet to damage the hardware that those systems are supposed to control. So let's take one piece of critical hardware, the large transformers. You could destroy these with a cyber attack. There are 2,100 of them in America, or in the United States. And if you destroyed these, they'd catch on fire, they'd burn, they'd explode, and they'd be unusable, and the surrounding grid would collapse. These units are about the size of a single-car garage. They're very large, difficult to transport. There are only a handful of factories in the world who make them, only a handful of skilled laborers who know how to build them. They're all handcrafted. They take 1 to 2 years to make today when everything's working perfectly. So if you were to destroy a large enough number of these transformers, you'd be in a race to replace those units before society collapsed. And likely we wouldn't be able to win that race. So if the grid were to go down hard and not come back up again without warning, our nuclear power plants and our chemical manufacturing facilities would also be at risk. The safety protocols of many of those facilities depend on electrical power. So if the grid goes down, there's backup generators. They come online to protect us. When that fuel runs out, in a worst-case scenario, there will be no delivery of new diesel fuel. And so when you no longer have electricity to secure those units, you're going to have explosions. People might remember Bhopal, India, a pesticide plant that had a gas leak, which resulted in an explosion that killed thousands of people, largest industrial disaster in world history. You'd have lots of that all over North America, and our nuclear power plants depend on electricity to cool the spent fuel. The reason why Fukushima melted down in Japan was that the generators stopped circulating water to cool the spent fuel rods, and then the reactors melted down. There are about 100 commercial nuclear reactors in the United States, and you would be looking at a lot of meltdowns. And on top of that, there's not food in your grocery store, so you're asking yourself how to feed your family. There's no water in the tap water. You're asking yourself, how do I give my kids water to drink? Where do I find safe drinking water? You can't flush your toilet. So you need to know how to dispose of your family's waste without getting them sick. There's no transportation. You can't get out. There's no communication. And if you let your imagination play that out, if you're in a large urban center, we're really talking about an apocalypse. If you're in the northern part of Canada, where things are more rural and your life does not depend on electrical power, you'll be inconvenienced, but you'll be able to find clean water, you'll be able to hunt food, and you'll be better off than those of us in the urban centers.
What would happen to hospitals and medicine?
There would be no more. So he'd be back to the Middle Ages. You wouldn't have advanced medical care. You wouldn't have any renewals of your prescription. There would be no more medicine. You would have medical care that wasn't dependent on electrical power, but you wouldn't have a replenishment of your supplies. It's estimated that most people in an urban setting will die of diseases vanquished by modern sanitation, things we could easily cure today. But without the assistance of electricity, we simply wouldn't be able to cope with it.
Do you think this has been happening in the sense that it's been tried and the government is hiding it because they weren't successful? Is there attempts on the grid every day?
There are cyber attacks, yes. Well, I don't want to get too vast in the conspiracy theory, but what we do know is that we have malware hidden in our enemy's infrastructure. They have malware hidden in ours. We're constantly testing it. Nobody is going to pull the trigger full scale because of mutually assured destruction. So it'd be similar to a nuclear war, a full exchange where nobody survives. But Russia did black out the Ukraine last year, 12 months ago, with a cyber attack. The BBC released a documentary our listeners can find on my website, benjamindancer.com. That documentary suggests that the blackout in 2003 of the eastern seaboard in Canada, the largest blackout in North American history, the thesis of the documentary is that was a cyber attack and that the government covered it up. And you can learn. As a matter of fact, if we run out of time and our listeners want to learn more about this issue, everything they need to know can be found at my website, benjamindancer.com, or in my book, Patriarch Run. The book has been endorsed by the leading experts in America, the national security experts who understand this issue. And they were thrilled about my book because I did such a careful job in depicting how vulnerable we are and laying out a realistic scenario. So that's a good way to learn about how all this could be done too. The book is called Patriarch Run.
Okay, and how long has it been out, your book, Patriarch Run?
It came out in October, so just
fairly
2
new.
months now almost.
2 months, it's fairly new.
Yeah, it's fairly new, and I've been talking on the radio about this since then, and most people in North America just don't understand our vulnerability. And it hasn't, until very recently, the last few months, the government wasn't taking it seriously. And we don't know for sure that the steps the government's going to take will be sufficient enough to rectify this problem. But we'll have to wait and see how it comes out.
So if let's say it goes up, the internet will go down. There'll be no more internet, no more Facebook, no more Twitter, no more Amazon, no more anything. Basically, it's like end of the world scenario.
Yeah, no more communication at all. And honestly, those are just inconveniences. Mm-hmm. That is a bummer. But that in itself is not an existential threat. No. When things get really real is when you realize not only will my cell phone not work, not only can I not use my computer or drive my car, I can't find any food. And I don't have safe water to drink. And when it gets to that level, human society will break down. My ethics and your ethics are one thing when we can feed our children. But if we can no longer take care of those who depend on us, most of us are going to have a change in our ethics, and we will do things we wouldn't do today.
So it would be like a Mad Max type scenario.
Yes. It's estimated, now in a worst case scenario, because there's a lot of different versions of this, in a worst case scenario, the grid goes down in all of North America. And in that case, you're looking at up to 90% casualties within the first year. Because there's nothing to eat, people are dying of diseases, and people are competing violently for whatever resources are left. Now, it could be that there's a form of attack or a space weather event that blacks out part of North America. In that case, you still have the rest of the continent that can come to the aid of the troubled part of the continent. But it's still not going to be pretty. If you remember Hurricane Katrina,
yes,
the entire world was able to come to Katrina's aid, all the resources on the planet, and it wasn't enough. You still had a catastrophe there in that city. So imagine if you have 12 to 20 to 30 large cities in that situation. Where are you going to get the manpower and the resources to mitigate that crisis? You might be able to stop it from reaching 90% casualties. Maybe you'll contain the problem at 50% or 30% casualties, but it will be a catastrophe.
And not to mention if in certain parts of North America it's winter, freezing cold weather. Yes. You know, the more I think about that, I kind of think you guys have an advantage in Canada in that your population is smaller. Because at the root, this is a population issue. If you remember how I opened, 100 years ago, you couldn't kill people this way because the population was small enough where we could feed ourselves without electricity. That is no longer true. Over the last 100 years, our civilization has unwittingly evolved to depend on electricity. My life, your life, the lives of our kids and grandkids are now staked to the power grid. So in Canada, there are fewer people, and the further north you go, the fewer people there are. And in an event like this, the further north you go, the safer you are, because you can live off the land. You know, our forefathers were able to cut down trees and keep themselves warm and feed themselves with their firearms. And as long as the population's small enough where you don't deplete the entire supply of wild game, you're going to be okay. Where I live in Colorado, there are plenty of elk and deer today. But in a situation like what we're talking about, it would take probably less than a year to drive those animals to extinction, because there are millions and millions of people who would be competing for those food calories. So what would happen? Would the elites, like I don't know, the president and all these people, would they be gone to Cheyenne Mountain and places like that, underground bunkers? Do they have like a plan of this, and down there they'd be able to survive while we people up here would be dying?
I live near Cheyenne Mountain. It's not a place I'd want to go.
Really?
The answer to your question is, yeah, if you're wealthy, you're probably going to be okay, because there's a couple things you can do if you're wealthy. You can get out. The president's plane, Air Force One, is protected from EMP type events. And if you had enough money and you set things up in advance, you can get out. For example, if you had an airplane or a boat, you could, if you acted soon enough before the society collapsed, you could go to a place that was relatively safe. But for people that didn't have the ability to transport themselves, yeah, it's a bummer. You can get about as far as your tank of gas is going to get you, and that's the end of the line.
Yeah, so because gas, it wouldn't. There'd be no more gas in the gas pump, and then you won't be able to use your car.
Yeah, in an EMP attack, a vehicle's large enough where it could be damaged in an EMP attack, and your car might be destroyed from that. What that looks like, so we talked about cyber attack and solar flares. An EMP attack would be similar to a nuclear attack, except the weapon is detonated high in the atmosphere, and a super EMP weapon is designed rather than to create blasts to destroy cities, it creates gamma rays. And so to take out Canada and North America, you could detonate this in the center of the United States, say above Kansas, at about the altitude of the International Space Station. And then anything from line of sight from that point would be at risk. So all satellites, aircraft, and then any electronics on the continent, southern Canada, all of the 48 states, and northern Mexico. And the most catastrophic loss would be those large transformers I mentioned earlier, but there are a lot of other electronic control systems to the power grid and our electronic infrastructure that would be at risk. So nobody would die from the nuclear blast. Nobody would even know it happened. You would see your lights go out, and perhaps your car would die, and you wouldn't be able to use your cell phone, and your communications would fail. And it would take a couple days for people to wake up to the fact that there's no electricity anywhere because you can't communicate.
Changing a bit the subject, how plausible, I know this is an old question, how plausible was Y2K to happen back then? Was that even a realistic scenario, or was this like fear-mongering?
You know, I remember Y2K, and I remember being scared because I moved into a new apartment on New Year's Eve of that year, and I don't know enough about computers to put a probability on that. I'm glad that turned out not to be a serious problem. But what we're talking about now is not speculation. What we're talking about now is hard science. What we're talking about now is there's no argument against it. Nobody's arguing the other side because we all know it's true. Our lives do depend on the power grid, and the grid is vulnerable because it was kind of put together over the course of many decades, and nobody thought about these types of threats, and nobody realized until it was much too late that our lives depend on the electricity. That kind of came as an afterthought. And now that we find ourselves in that situation, we're struggling to find a solution.
How about, like, can they do this through, like, say, some kind of like computer virus through a USB stick? Can they do this and take down the power or cause any certain type of damage?
Oh, yes. So we might remember Stuxnet.
Yeah.
A few years ago, Israel, perhaps with the help of the United States, we were able to get a worm through a USB drive into a nuclear processing facility in Iran. That facility was not connected to the internet, and that worm was designed to travel from device to device until it finally found its target. And it was able to destroy the hardware, to destroy those centrifuges, and set back that nuclear program. So those worms are all over the place today. They're in our hardware now. We find them in our nuclear power plants. We find them in the software of our chemical manufacturing facilities. They're all over our infrastructure today. And we have similar worms in the infrastructure of our enemies. And we're always testing those capabilities. We're always trying to see how deep we can infiltrate. And nobody's pulling the trigger on that weapon in a full-scale way because of mutually assured destruction. But what's to keep a terrorist or a kid in his college dorm from acquiring this type of technology? In my book, the bad guy wants to take down the grid with a cyber attack, and that can be done. A very small number of people without a lot of resources or means could destroy entire countries. And North America is not the only region at risk. If your civilization has evolved where you depend on electricity, you're at risk. So it's a global problem.
And it doesn't help that now with the internet we're even more globally connected. And the reason the internet was created back then was in case of a nuclear war, and it's so vulnerable without electricity, you know?
Yes. So there's a video on my website in my discussion guide. Because the bad guy in my book uses a cyber attack, I wrote a discussion guide for readers who are interested in learning more about the factual information behind the story. There's a video in that discussion guide on benjamindancer.com. One of the leading cybersecurity experts in the world is discussing in front of the National Academies of Sciences how vulnerable our critical infrastructure is and how easy it would be to take down our infrastructure and cause mass casualties. For example, hydroelectric dams, nuclear power plants, chemical manufacturing facilities, traffic lights, trains. You could manipulate those control systems to use them as weapons of mass destruction.
Now, like you said, if a college dorm does this, would there be any warning signs? And how long would it take for a college dorm people to do this?
In the documentary I mentioned earlier that the BBC put out about the 2003 blackout, they interviewed some hackers, and one of the hackers interviewed for that documentary said that if I had a week to study the issue, I could do this in a single day. He said it's that easy. You can watch that video at benjamindancer.com. So he knows more about the issue than I do.
Right.
But I think those who understand how to write the software code, there are no security protocols to defeat this. The problem isn't getting past the security. The problem is knowing how to manipulate the software to destroy the critical hardware. As soon as you have that information, that is all you need.
Would the Pentagon detect it, or NORAD, or some organization like this?
Sure, after the fact. So once you set off a worm like that, you're going to have blackouts, you're going to have critical infrastructure failing. And sure, if you did it on a minor level and you didn't cripple the whole country, they would do their forensics and try to find out who did it. Ted Koppel wrote a book, Lights Out. He's a very well-known journalist, and the whole book is about cyber attack, and you can learn more about that book at my website as well. And he interviews a lot of the world's experts on this issue, and it's shocking how easy it would be. But you know what? Even if you could forensically learn that it happened after the fact, so what? I don't think if you and I are starving to death, what we're going to care about in that moment is knowing who did it to us.
Right.
We're just going to be looking for something to eat.
Does this concern...
There's another...
Go ahead.
I was going to talk about the mechanism of destruction we haven't got into yet, mechanical sabotage, just to illustrate how easy this is. The Metcalf substation is in the Bay Area on the West Coast. A group of people used AK-47s to puncture the oil tanks of the large transformers, believing the oil tanks to overheat the units, destroying the units. And they took down a whole substation that way, just a very small team of people. So it's that easy. Now, there are more effective ways to destroy a substation than with a rifle, but those aren't things I think we should talk about on the air.
No.
But it does illustrate that we built this system to give us reliable electricity under certain circumstances. The circumstance we never considered when we thought about our security was an intentional attack, because we are wide open to that from all sorts of angles, from small groups of people. You might remember some folks in protest of a hydroelectric dam in Canada started pulling the bolts out of the transmission towers.
Yes.
So in that case, all you need is a wrench and some guys to go around pulling out those bolts. And if those transmission towers fell over, you would disrupt the transmission of that electricity. You could do that continent-wide.
But you see, if a hacker does that, they destroys all infrastructure. In effect, he'll be destroying himself also, because then he won't be able to eat or even go on a computer or do anything.
That's right.
It's almost suicidal.
Well, there are small groups of people who would call that paradise. There are folks out there who imagine that world, no electricity, no internet, take us back to the Stone Age or the Middle Ages, and to them that's a paradise. So although it's a catastrophe for you and I, there are people who would like to perpetrate that on us.
But don't they realize that we're not living in the Middle Ages? We're not equipped for that. We don't have the same system, and to go back to that system is probably impossible.
Let's talk about the bad guy in my book for just a minute. His concern, his motivation is the sixth extinction. So for listeners who don't know what that is, most scientists believe that humans are causing the sixth great extinction, similar to when the dinosaurs went out. That would be the fifth great extinction. And so we're in the middle of an extinction event that we're causing because there's so many of us. And in the bad guy's point of view, it would be better to kill several billion people today and avoid that ecological catastrophe in the future where many more billions of people would die when the population got bigger. So in his logic, the ethical thing to do is to kill billions of us now to preserve more people later. And what's scary about my book, what scares me about it, is there's a realistic way where a small group of people could actually inflict that large of damage. And so it's frightening to me, and it's interesting to me, and one of the things I'm doing as a part of my book release is raising awareness about the threat, because if people like you and I get it and understand it, we can demand that we fix the problem. Our governments are not going to spend the money, our industries are not going to spend the money unless the people demand it. And we need to wake folks up to the threat, because your life and my life depends on reliable electrical power. Without it, we can't survive.
How much would this cost to fix?
Billions of dollars. There are a number of ways. People are talking about all sorts of ways it can be fixed. I don't want to take a side on that, but just to illustrate examples, you can harden the existing grid. And the reason why I don't want to say what's the best way to go is I really don't know. And I think it's more important right now that we choose to fix it and then figure out the best way to fix it. So to harden the existing system, you would shield critical parts of the infrastructure from EMP. You would also put types of circuit breakers into the system so you couldn't destroy the transformers, for example, with a surge of electrons. And then you'd also need to harden things from cyber attack. So you can harden the present grid, or you could create a brand new grid. Our grid's so vulnerable because of cascading failures. It's all interconnected. When there's a problem in one place, it cascades hundreds, if not thousands of miles elsewhere. We could build a network of grids that wasn't prone to that type of catastrophe. And when we did that, here's the cool thing, we could introduce renewables. So if you're going to harden the grid and redo the whole thing and build it so it's not as vulnerable, there's a plan in place right now by Sandy McDonald, who ran the largest NOAA laboratory in America, which is in Boulder. His plan would get us to 80% renewable energy in 15 years with today's technology and harden the grid. So his two concerns are climate change and national security. In his plan, you solve both problems with one solution. So I think it's really interesting to talk about possibilities.
How likely is it that we have to fear Russia and China in doing something like this?
Well, Russia and China have an interest in their own self-preservation. My understanding is that both those countries have super EMP weapons. That's a nuclear device designed to take down electrical infrastructure rather than to destroy the physical cities. And they also have the capacity to do the cyber attack. But if they did that to us, we would still have the capacity to retaliate and destroy them. However, a state like North Korea, a state like Iran, there are rogue states in the world that might act irrationally. And even if we have the capacity to destroy them, they still might be willing to do something like this. And then, of course, there are all the terrorist groups we talked about earlier.
Do you think that ISIS has the capability to do this right now?
They want it. They're working hard to get it. So we know that ISIS understands that this is the most effective and likely way for them to destroy America. And so they understand how vulnerable we are. They understand the mechanisms of destruction we've talked about. And they would very much like to gain access to that technology. It seems to me that a nuclear device or a cyber device would be the two easiest ways for ISIS to do it. But then again, if there were a dozen small teams who know what they were doing in America, that would be enough to take down the power grid continent-wide through sabotage. So, yeah, it's a real threat.
Do you think right now there's any concerns by the president, the president-elect, he's going to do something like put a special committee,
Yes, both presidents understand this threat, Obama and Trump, including the Prime Minister in Canada. So over the summer, that joint Canadian-U.S. task force to secure the power grid, they did work through the summer and fall, and they're going to release their report on their recommendations in December. So our governments are well aware of this. Obama has done more than any other president in American history to secure the grid, because this is a new threat. And then President-elect Donald Trump said just last week that his national security priority on day one, when he takes office, is to sign executive actions to harden our critical infrastructure from the types of attacks we're talking about. So what remains to be seen is how effective those actions will be.
What can be done against the sun and its massive solar flares? Is there any protection? Because that can happen, I suppose, any time. It could happen tonight without no warning.
Yes, it could. We do have satellites in place now to give us warning. We'd have anywhere between a few hours to a few days of warning, depending on the speed of the event. What we need to do for the sun is we need to harden the infrastructure from that type of space weather event, so that if it did happen, the most important parts of the grid wouldn't be destroyed. We know how to do that. It's really not that difficult, but it does cost money. And because for a couple of reasons, the problem hasn't been solved. It costs money, so nobody wants to spend the money, and then nobody wants to own the problem. Should it be owned by the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy? Should it be owned by the private industry who own that section of the grid? Who should pay for this? Who should take ownership for it? And so we're going to need direction from on high just to mandate how this needs to be done so that we can efficiently tackle the problem.
Is there many people in the media that know about this, or is this just a little problem that's just being swept away? Does CNN know anything about this?
Yes. Anybody who pays attention understands the threat. Especially, I find that conservative folks tend to be more aware of this than others, because they've been talking about it for a long time. But recently, people on the progressive and liberal side of the spectrum have also become much more aware. So people who are paying attention are aware, but it's kind of like a nuclear war. Like, the problem seems so big, and people kind of feel like, what can I do about it? And it's an overwhelming problem. So it's important that we keep talking about it, because it's important that there be a broad awakening in North America that our lives depend on electrical power, and our power grid is really, really vulnerable. We really have two choices. We can either reduce our population so that if the grid went down, it would be an inconvenience, but it wouldn't be an existential threat. Or we can choose to stake our lives to electrical power and keep our large population, in which case we better harden the system so that it's not as vulnerable.
So if they start, let's say tomorrow, they have the money, everything in place to fix it, how long would it take to fix all of this?
Well, Sandy McDonald, the guy whose proposal is to use renewable energy to fix this, his proposal says it takes 15 years. So 15 years from now it could all be done. Now in 2008, the EMP Commission issued a report with very specific recommendations, and it's 8 years later now, and not one of their recommendations has been followed. So we've lost 8 years. I don't think we're going to lose another 8. I think we're taking it more seriously today. But it would be easier for politicians to make good and right decisions if the people demanded it. When there's a mandate from the people, it's a lot easier for our elected officials to listen.
Do you think the internet is very, very fragile? Because it's supposed to withstand nuclear war, and it seems so fragile. Just one little hiccup, and we can't get online.
The internet would not withstand a nuclear war. No, it is very fragile. There are a couple choke points of the internet where if you were able to disrupt those choke points, you could shut the internet down for the majority of people.
So there is a way to shut down the internet.
Yeah, there is. And when I look at the magnitude of the threat we're talking about, people always ask me about, what about my car or my cell phone or my computer or the internet? And my response to all that is, that's the last thing you're going to care about. Because in an event like what we're talking about, you're going to be thinking about things like, where do I poop? And how do I not get sick from that because I can't flush my toilet? And I'm thirsty, and how do I find something to drink that won't kill me? And after I solve those problems, where do I get my next meal? And so when we think about the power grid going down, we really need to focus on that. It's about life and death. It's not about inconveniences.
And when you tell, I'm sure you go around like talking about your book and people, what are their reactions to this? Do they feel the same way that we're concerned?
When people understand it, they're then concerned. I've never spoken to anybody about this who didn't get it and then wanted something to be done about it. It's new information for most people.
Yeah.
And when I'm talking about my book, I connect it to sustainability. So as an author, when I'm working on that side of there's two sides of this for me. When I'm working for the EMP task force, then our message is harden the grid, and I stick to national security because that's my role with them. When I'm speaking about myself as an author and my personal preferences, which are separate, I'm very concerned about sustainability. And if my personal belief is this, if we were to solve the problem of the grid, we still have a greater problem in our hands, and that's that there's so many of us. In Canada, your population is so much smaller than the population of the United States. There are 375 million or 25 million Americans, 7.5 billion people on the planet. When there were 2 billion people prior to electricity, you could do what you wanted, and it would be kind of hard to hurt the larger ecosystem. 2 billion people driving to work and heating their house and feeding their kids, that doesn't have the same effect on the planet as 7.5 billion people doing the same activities. I don't think those activities are evil, and I don't think people are bad. But if there's going to be this many of us, we have to be really careful about our activities because we are heating up the planet, we're driving other species to extinction, and all of those environmental catastrophes come back to one overarching problem, and that's how many human beings need to take care of themselves. And I don't want to tell any person that they can't clothe themselves and eat and secure their families, and we all need to do that. It's just a lot easier if there's fewer of us. That way our impact isn't as bad. Those are the two themes in my book, trying to look at both of these problems, which are really real, and in a really dramatic way draw attention to them so that we can start talking about them as people. Because until we talk about them, we're not gonna find a solution to these two problems.
Do you think there's elements within the government that want this to happen secretly, and they're trying to do this?
No. If you're talking about elements in the government as like a conspiracy, no, I don't think anybody in the American or Canadian government would like this. Now, are there individuals? Might there be a person like the bad guy in my book that dreams of a world where we weren't driving all these other species to extinction? Yeah, I bet there's a guy or two or a woman or two that thinks it would be better for this to happen than for us to go on. But I don't think there's an organized official body that wishes us harm.
What about Anonymous? Do you think they have the capability of doing this if they chose to do this, which I hope they wouldn't want to?
From watching that BBC documentary and listening to those hackers, I don't know that if they're a part of Anonymous or not. But if we're to trust the BBC and what those hackers presented, yes, there are plenty of individuals who could do this if they decided to kill millions and millions and millions of people.
And I hope they wouldn't want to do that, because then hackers, they love the computers, and if they do this, they won't use the computers anymore. So they might, they might be bored themselves.
Yes, they would end up bored. I think there are people out there who want to make a name for themselves, and it would be really foolish of us to leave such an easy target where somebody could be remembered forever for such a dastardly thing. So, yeah, it is President-elect Donald Trump declared this as his number one priority for national security. And so I think he understands how vulnerable we are.
So it's not building the wall. So this is more important than obviously building a wall.
Well, I don't want to speak for. I was trying to quote him earlier.
Yeah.
So if you want to go to his website and watch, it's like a 2-minute video where he laid out his priorities. He did talk about, and I don't really want to get into politics either, because that's separate from what I'm concerned about. So what he'll do with that wall and with his other issues, I don't know. But I did hear him say very clearly that there are infrastructures at risk to cyber attack and other forms of attack.
Could computer viruses do this?
Yep. That would be a really effective way to do it.
Can Norton or security and cyber security groups stop this, like Norton or anything like this? Or is this even too powerful for them?
No, you couldn't stop it with things like that. What we've done in North America, well, let me speak for the United States, because I know more about our system. We have always, for the last few decades, erred on the side of making things more efficient, less manpower, more electronic. So we've really gone to electronic controls all over our critical infrastructure. And that's been a wonderful efficiency. So there are so many good things about it economically. However, we've now left ourselves wide open for cyber trouble. So if you think about the evolution of your car or any of the things in your life, your appliances, you've noticed over the course of the last few decades that they've become more and more computerized. And that has been wonderful on many aspects. The unfortunate reality, however, is if something is computerized, it's now vulnerable to hack. And so we have left ourselves wide open, including our life support systems, food, water, things like that. And
the way I see things going, let's say there's no hacking and they don't right away. They don't fix it or anything. What in like 25, 30 years, when say if we're still around, people are still around, no disasters happen, and they want to put like these computers in us, like kind of cyborgs.
Yeah. When I was writing the book, there's an AI, artificial intelligence component of my novel, Patriarch Run. The bad guy uses artificial intelligence in order to amplify his cyber attack. And for a while, I really considered going into making the novel about the singularity, the idea that technology advances so fast it can start to think for itself. But the software the bad guy uses in my book is called Yanxi. It's developed in China, and he's a spy, and he goes and steals it. It can write its own code. It's self-aware, so it's self-optimizing. It can build factories, or it can design factories to build its own hardware, and it's growing at an exponential rate, getting smarter and smarter. And so once it gets access to nanotechnology, this software could build anything, do anything, and become a threat perhaps to humanity itself. And I did consider taking the novel in that direction, kind of like the Terminator or Matrix, where we've reached this technological singularity. Right now it exists as a theme in the book and part of a plot, but I didn't develop it all the way.
How advanced is the government that we don't know that soon we're all going to be cyborgs or robots or whatever? Is it like that far away?
I don't think the government could answer that question. Whether or not that will happen is interesting. We are certainly more mechanized every year, right? So we have more hardware and software in our bodies. If you have medical concerns, a lot of those are resolved with software that's connected to hardware. That'll be interesting to see if we ever get to the Terminator or the Matrix.
Or iRobot.
Yeah. So maybe that'll be my next book. I'll write about that.
How long did it take you to write this book?
I had the first draft done in 2010, and then it sat for a while, and then the final draft was written a year ago. And so it took me a while to go from draft to publication, and now that it's been published, people are really enjoying it because it's an exciting thriller. It's been endorsed by the national security experts we've been talking about. It's been endorsed by sustainability NGOs. For if people know Paul Ehrlich, the famous conservation biologist, and the Center for Biological Diversity. And there are a lot of sustainability folks partnering with me and advising me as I talk about these issues. And it's got firearms and guns, and one of the leading expert on the psychology of combat endorsed the book for its realism. So it's an exciting story that deals with really powerful themes. It deals with fatherhood, what it means to be a father, what it means to decide what type of man we want to be, and it's packaged in it'll feel like a movie to its readers, like an action movie. And so you get these really deep, meaningful things that are going to make you think about your life and the world, and it's packaged in a story that's going to entertain the heck out of you. One of my favorite aspects of the book is there are two father figures, one who sacrifices his family for his mission and another who sacrifices himself for his son. Because I think that's an interesting spectrum for us to examine as we decide what type of parents we want to be in our own lives.
Is any plans in the works to make a movie out of this book, Patriarch?
Not yet. Yeah, in my heart and mind there are. Everybody who reads it talks about the fact that it reads like a movie and it should be a movie. So if I get my way, you guys are going to get to see the movie. I wrote it from beginning to end with that in mind so that it would be easy to adapt the plot and the story as a screenplay.
Is there, without saying anything, is there a good ending to it or a bad ending, or is it just left to be determined?
I I'll tell the listeners this. I don't like fluffy endings, and I like deep, meaningful stories where hard things happen because I think that's more like real life. And so you get to the end of these books, and the characters you really care about have been punished and survived a great deal, and they lose a great deal. And I'm going to write a sequel to the book where the story will take off where this one leaves. And so I love the ending of the story because it's not too fluffy. It's not too cynical. I think it gets it just right.
Where can we get your book exactly? Where is it available? And for viewers and listeners to get that book?
The best place to get it is Amazon.com, and you can read all about it at my website, BenjaminDancer.com, and you can buy the book on Amazon.
Okay, perfect. And in final, before we end the show, is there anything you would like to add that maybe I haven't questioned or anything like this? Feel free.
Yeah, I just encourage anybody listening, A, read my story. I think you'll learn a lot about this issue in the story, and I think you'll just enjoy it. It deals with a lot of important themes. B, if anything matters, if we've talked about anything in the last hour that's important to you, please go to my website. There's a link or a page on my website, Partner With Me. You can sign up to work on these issues with me. If you care about these things, we can work together to solve these problems, whether that be the grid or the sustainability crisis we were talking about at the end of this interview.
Is there any hashtags or anything like this that we can put, we can share it all over the internet and wake up people to this?
The hashtags people use for the grid are Stop EMP or Secure the Grid. Those are the two most popular hashtags on that. And then the environmental hashtags are overpopulation. The overpopulation issue is the root problem of everything that's driving us crazy as a people today. So all these other things that bother us are unintended consequences of overpopulation.
Perfect. Well, that concludes the show for tonight. We want to thank you very much for coming on the show. Once the show is up, we'll be sure to share it for everybody and all our viewers and try and wake up people. The more people are aware, the more can be done, I suppose.
Yeah, send me a link so I can advertise what we did.
For sure. Once it's all up, we will send you the link. So, Benjamin, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been wonderful. We'll have to have you back sometime.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
All right. Have a good night. Thank you.
You too.
Bye.
Yes.
Well, that was a wake-up call for the folks up there. I mean, it's just scary. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Mary, before we end?
And the information just came in so fast, so much information that I have to rewatch this show just to, get all the information, because there's just so much great information that came in. But another thing, all the links that he's talking about, what's going to be in the description or underneath right here somewhere. I'm going to try and place it somewhere so everybody gets his email address. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do a live hangout like you normally always get to see. But you know what? Technology is not going to stop us from using our brain and finding a loophole around the situation, right there, Robert? But yeah, you know what? This is technology, and we can't depend too much on this technology because, there's always failures somewhere or another, whether it's with AMP's machines and with all of the grid, and we're all depending on the grid, and we're all screwed.
Exactly, so that's it, because we're supposed to do a hangout show, but it's not working. There's a bug or something, so we have to go on this. But, we all try to find a loophole, but if this EMP attack happens or power grid goes down or a mass solar flare, there will be no loopholes or anything about it. It's literally some kind of digital apocalypse of some kind. But anyhow, that's it for this week. So we want to thank you and share the show, folks. Share the show when it's up on the links up there. And we will be back next week with another show. So thank you very much for watching MnRTV Live Show tonight with special guest Benjamin Dancer. How vulnerable is the power grid?
All right. Have a good night. Thank you all for watching.